Lifting the snow blockade to Marshall, Minnesota occurred in April 1881. Let's take a closer look at how it was accomplished. The winter of 1880-1881 produced a large number of snowstorms, which periodically shut down rail service across the upper Midwest. Due to the number and severity of these storms, they began to make headlines in the larger cities, like this one in the Chicago Tribune. Marshall was a relatively new town in southwest Minnesota, along the Winona and St. Peter division of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. This rail line started in Winona, then passed through Rochester, Owatonna, Mankato, St. Peter, and New Ulm. From New Ulm, the line extended westward through Sleepy Eye, Springfield, Lamberton, Walnut Grove, and Tracy, before reaching Marshall. Marshall was the county seat of Lyon County, and its population in 1880 was just under 1,000 people. The man in charge of keeping the Winona and St. Peter division of the railroad open was Superintendent Sanborn. Sanborn was born on September 15, 1834, in New Hampshire. In April 1881, he was 46 years old and lived in Winona. Sanborn was very popular with his employees. He was always willing to grant them time off in emergency situations, and he could fill in at whatever job was needed. In early January 1881, Sanborn was in the Kasota area, clearing snow from the tracks. A local newspaper mentioned several instances of kindness from Sanborn. He first noticed several girls who did not get off the train to eat. He sent for them to come and eat at his expense. He told another woman, who was stuck in the area due to the snow blockade, that he would cover her expenses until the railroad line was cleared. Sanborn had likely never seen a winter like this one. The first winter storm struck on October 15, 1880, and lasted through the 16th and 17th. Winter storms are designated in blue on these calendars, with the earliest storm beginning on October 15th and the last storm occurring on April 11th. The winter of 1880-1881 lasted about 6 months. The early arrival of this first storm astonished the residents of Marshall. An article in the Lyon County News said the storm was unusually severe, with many people woefully unprepared for winter. The writer noted that the storm was a wake-up call, and it would long be remembered by the people of the area. Although there were multiple winter storms from October to December 1880, trains were still able to break through the large drifts. The last train reached Marshall on January 19th, 1881, which was followed by the 3-day storm, which began on January 20th. In Marshall, the newspaper provided some comments on the storm. The Lyon County News called the railroad stoppage Blockade Number 6. The newspaper joked that the railroad spent 6 days trying to clear the track. Then when they took Sunday off, the cuts filled back in again. Since this was a 3-day storm, the trains that became stuck in the snow were abandoned, and their crews walked to the nearest stations for shelter. By the time the storm had ended, several trains were completely buried in snow. Some details on the winter were also obtained from Tracy. Tracy, similar to Marshall, had been without rail service since January 19th. Merchants could not get groceries. Oil was not available for lamps. Stores, offices, and churches were closed because there was no fuel or lights. Life was very dull, and there was no social life whatsoever. A correspondent from Tyler also provided some details from that town. The last train there was on January 30th. The writer also mentioned how illy prepared people were for winter. Ironically, it was thought that the experiences people went through would be interesting reading. Years later, Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, The Long Winter, would do just that. Residents in that area had been burning hay for heat, grinding wheat in coffee mills for flour, and were completely out of meat and potatoes. Finally, a few details emerged about the Minneota area. Like the other towns, wood and coal were mostly unavailable. Nice days were noted by hundreds of snowshoe tracks in the streets, when people actually ventured into town to obtain any available goods. The day the Marshall Blockade started, January 20th, John J. Randall, a Winona wood and coal dealer, went west to St. Peter to check on his various supply points along the Winona and St. Peter division. He found that about 50 railroad cars of coal and 60 cars of wood were hung up east of St. Peter, awaiting shipment further west. Randall, a long-time Winona resident, was born in 1829 in New York. He had served in the Civil War, achieving the rank of captain. In early 1881, he would have been about 51 years old. As the railroad was blockaded by snow west of St. Peter, Randall had to take a horse team to get to Sleepy Eye. At Sleepy Eye, he found 15 railroad cars of wood for stations further west. However, with no hope of opening the railroad line, he sold a few carloads of the wood to the residents around Sleepy Eye. Then, after another big storm from February 4th to 6th, Randall decided to sell the rest of the wood as well. The early February storm also generated big headlines in the big city newspapers. However, these accounts began to contain words like suffering and being cut off for some time. This was bad publicity for the railroads. Randall, still in Sleepy Eye, sent a telegram to the Winona Republican, saying those accounts were false. He said there was enough fuel to last at least another month. Sanborn likely realized that Sleepy Eye residents had enough fuel, but he was concerned about the settlers west of Sleepy Eye. Sanborn asked Randall to go further west, at the expense of the railroad, to open a road for those settlers to get to Sleepy Eye for supplies. At Springfield, Randall found that fuel supplies were still good. At Lamberton and Walnut Grove, Randall reported that wood could still be found. More concerned about Tracy, Randall bought a ton of flour in Walnut Grove to take with him. At Tracy, fuel was scarcer. Randall found many people were burning hay for fuel, some in preference to green wood. Some families were also burning corn. To help alleviate the fuel shortage, Randall sent a group of 15 men to open a road to a supply of wood about 10 miles away. He also sent men to Springfield and Sleepy Eye for coal. In mid-March, the headlines of huge drifts across southwestern Minnesota caught the attention of Elmer and Tenney, photographers from Winona. This firm sent William Snell to the Sleepy Eye area to take a series of pictures of the huge snowdrifts. William Snell was born in May 1855 in New Hampshire. His father was a minister who moved to Rushford, Minnesota in 1870. William would have been about 25 years old in early 1881. Snell's photographs were a series of stereoscopic views, which are two photographs side by side attached to a cardboard backing. When this card is inserted into a special viewer, it gives the illusion of depth. The back of the card contained the description of the photograph. In this instance, this view was part of the snow blockade views, taken on the Winona and St. Peter division. The card also advertised views that were taken on the southern Minnesota and Hastings and Dakota railroads. Turning the back of the card to make it more legible, it explains the views were produced on March 22, 1881. The numbers on the back are a key for a number that appears on the front of the card. In this instance, 1141 is the east approach to Kelly's Cut. The number on the front is found in the lower right. The group of photographs taken on March 22, 1881 were all around Oshawa and Sleepy Eye. Oshawa was located just west of St. Peter in Nicollet County, and Sleepy Eye was west of New Ulm in Brown County. Let's take a look at this set of stereo views one by one. View 1132 was the snow cut at Oshawa Station. As mentioned before, Oshawa was a small town west of St. Peter. For space considerations, only one side of the stereo view is shown. Shovelers and a train are shown in the upper right. View 1133 was Bresling's Cut, 1½ miles west of Oshawa. Shovelers and a train were working to clear the track. View 1134 was the Goose Lake Cut, east of Oshawa. Goose Lake itself would have been a wide open area, easily susceptible to blowing snow. The view shows a number of men digging out the rail line. View 1135 was Kelly's Cut, 1/2 mile west of Sleepy Eye. The description also mentions the shovelers are just beginning the work, as seen in the photo on the right. View 1136 was boarding the train in Kelly's Cut. The photo shows the shovelers on top of the railroad car, looking happy to be noticed. View 1137 was Kelly's Cut with Sleepy Eye in the distance. The photo shows 2 tiers of shovelers. One group likely shoveled blocks of snow to the men on the second tier, who moved it out of the way. View 1138 also showed Kelly's Cut. The sides of the cut look very steep, and the title asks, "How are we going to get out?" The shovelers did make it out, as view 1139 showed Kelly's Cut open once more. The photo showed the train moving toward the photographer. View 1140 showed the east end of 47 Mile Cut. I am not sure exactly where this was, but it was likely somewhere between Oshawa and Sleepy Eye. The train operators definitely had the easier job here. View 1141 showed the east approach to Kelly's Cut. The photo shows the shovelers on top of the train car again, so they were likely moving to the next spot to clear. View 1142 was taken a 1/4 mile west of Sleepy Eye. The photo on the right shows several women in the deep cut, with the snowplow visible in the back. View 1143 asks, "What is a locomotive good for?" The photo shows a snowplow attached to the front of the engine, with nowhere for the snow to go, other than being pushed straight ahead. View 1144 is back to Kelly's Cut, entitled "The Last Shovelful." The photo shows the shovelers lined up along the edge of the cut, with the plow in the lower right. When snow returned to Winona, the views were quickly reproduced by Elmer and Tenney. Their first display quickly sold out, with orders coming from as far away as Cleveland, Ohio. Back in New Ulm, gusty winds on March 21st blew snow back into the railroad cuts, blocking railroad traffic again. The blockades were definitely affecting people. A resident of Walnut Grove wrote that settlers came to town every day they could, wondering, with tears in their eyes, if their families would be left to freeze to death. To cope, alcohol was also in high demand. Sanborn, who had been helping to open a snow blockade between Chicago and Elroy, returned to Sleepy Eye on March 23rd. Immediately upon his arrival, he telegraphed his agent in Marshall to see what the situation was there. To survey the situation for himself, Sanborn left Sleepy Eye in a sleigh, stopping at every farmhouse and every station along the railroad line. He finally reached Marshall on March 30th. Sanborn lost no time setting a plan in place. The dead engine was pulled out of the engine house and fired up. Sanborn ordered his men to tear down the coaling platform and the engine house if necessary to keep the engine running. Sanborn's arrival boosted the spirits of the residents of Marshall, but it was short-lived. Another blizzard arrived that same day. The blowing snow felt like a blast of sand. During the storm, Sanborn encountered a stranger in a Marshall drugstore. The man struck up a conversation with Sanborn, saying, "Bad storm, sir." "It is very bad," replied Sanborn. "I wish the folks down on the eastern end of this road could see this. It would make them open their eyes on storms. If Sanborn would only come out here, he'd find out for himself what kind of storms we have. By the way, I heard he was coming out here soon." "So I've heard," said Sanborn. "Are you connected with the road, mister?" asked the man. "I used to be," said Sanborn. "What's your name?" "Sanborn, and I've come out to see about this reported suffering. Where do you live?" "At Lake Shukatan, halfway to Lake Benton." "Have you had any trouble this winter to get along?" asked Sanborn. "Yes, sir, I have." "Where do you get your supplies?" asked Sanborn. "At Lake Benton." "Did you ever go to Lake Benton and fail to get what you wanted?" asked Sanborn. "No, sir, but there have been storms out here that I couldn't go outdoors for 10 days at a time." "Would you have been any better off? Had a train run into Lake Benton every day?" asked Sanborn. "No, sir, I guess not. That is, no, sir." Sanborn was trying to get the man to understand that winter storms also prevented the settlers from getting to town, just like the railroad. On April 2nd, Sanborn returned to Winona after setting his plan in motion. The plan went into action on April 3rd, with one group of men, personally directed by either Sanborn or one of his subordinates, working west from Sleepy Eye. This was a larger group, with about 175 men, 3 engines, 2 with plows, 4 coaches for the shovelers to sleep in, and cars for cooking, provisions, and fuel. This group could work, eat, and sleep on the job site. From the Marshall end, the work eastward was led by Conductor Reed. This group contained 40 men, 1 engine, and 1 caboose. The Marshall group had to travel back and forth from Marshall every day to work. To bump up their numbers, Sanborn authorized Reed to hire all the men he could get at $1.25 per day. Since April 3rd was a Sunday, Reed's group first debated whether they should actually start work. After deciding it was okay, they started out with a baggage car instead of their caboose. Needless to say, once the group encountered a cut that had already been dug out, they found the baggage car was wider than the caboose. That cut was at Lake Marshall, and the baggage car was nearly tipped over after running into it. Only 1 man was injured, and he was taken back to Marshall on the baggage car. Sanborn returned on April 5th to spearhead the group working west from Sleepy Eye. Sanborn had his own rail car, which included a coal stove, a few chairs, a table, reversed car seats, which turned into beds, a toilet, a pantry, and a cooking stove. West of Sleepy Eye, warm afternoon temperatures were putting a crust on the snowpack, which required picks to break through in places. On April 7th, Sanborn's group reached Springfield. The following day, another group of shovelers reached Redwood Falls, where the residents greeted the men with rockets, fireworks, and loud cheers. On April 10th, Reed's men broke through to Amoret. The snowdrifts between Amoret and Tracy were not as bad as the other stretches. On April 12th, a reporter for the Lyon County News drove out to meet Sanborn's group, which was located between Springfield and Lamberton. The reporter noted that if people could witness the amount of labor and perseverance Going into clearing the railroad tracks, they would see that no human power could have kept the railroad open during the winter. Not to say Sanborn didn't try. He rolled out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. Throughout the day he directed, shoveled, or manned a pick or a bar. At quitting time he went to the telegraph office, read dispatches, sent dispatches, and gave orders for the next day. When this was complete, Sanborn could begin drying out his clothes for the next day, and tumble into his couch to sleep. Sanborn began using a new scheme to clear deep snow out of the cuts. The first step was digging a narrow channel on either side of the track, just wide enough for a man to pass. Then cross sections were cut about every 10 feet. This left a huge block of snow, generally about 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 10 feet high. The engine and plow would then move forward and nudge the snow block enough to break its base loose. All the engine generally had to do was bump the snow block. Then a cable was run around the snow block a little below its center, with pieces of wood inserted behind the cable to keep it from cutting the block. This stereo view shows the cable mounted to the front of an engine strung around the snow block. Here is a representation of an engine getting ready to pull out a block of snow. The engine then backed out of the cut, pulling the giant snow block with it. This representation shows an engine backing up with a block of snow. Finally, a gang of men pushed the giant block over onto the open prairie. This photo shows a block of snow still attached to the engine, before it was pushed off the track. The Lyon County News reporter said it was quite a sight to see these long lines of huge snow blocks, which were left to melt along the side of the railroad. This is a representation of what this may have looked like. In addition to the Lyon County News, Elmer and Tenney's photographer, William Snell, had also come west to document the event. This set of views were produced on April 15th, so they would have been taken several days before. The first views were taken near Cottonwood Tank, which I am guessing was located near the railroad bridge over the Cottonwood River, which was a few miles east of Lamberton. View 1191 was taken at Cottonwood Tank. I do not have this photograph. View 1192 was also taken near Cottonwood Tank, which shows a deep snowdrift. The next few views were taken near Lamberton. View 1193 was cutting huge blocks of snow. I do not have this photograph. View 1194 also shows men cutting large blocks of snow. View 1195 shows the engine getting ready to pull out a huge block of snow. View 1196 shows an engine pulling out blocks of snow. I do not have this photograph. View 1197 shows an engine with a plow ramming the snow. View 1198 shows another engine with a plow pushing through deep snow. View 1199 shows another engine and plow at work. The next view was taken near Sanborn, a town which was named after Superintendent Sanborn. View 1200 was a train buried in deep snow. Sanborn's team broke through to Lamberton on April 12th. Within 5 minutes of this achievement, 18 cars of freight were brought into town. View 1201 shows the first train in 3 months at Lamberton. 6 days later, Sanborn's group broke through to Walnut Grove. View 1202 shows Cold Water Cut near Tracy. I do not have that photograph either. The New Ulm Review carried an interesting story that mentioned cold water in a cut. The story said that men had been shoveling out a drift for quite some time. Finally, Sanborn ordered the snow and plow to ram the remaining snow. When the plow struck the spot, it revealed a large amount of water below. The spray of water put out the fire in the engine and drenched the nearby shovelers, hence Cold Water Cut. Conductor Reed's men reached Tracy at 3:45 p.m. on April 18th and saw Sanborn's group a short distance east of town. He continued clearing the road for a short distance, where Sanborn walked out to meet him. Here Reed learned Sanborn's plow had been disabled. Reed's group that day included about 100 men from Marshall. As these men were digging out the Tracy depot, they asked where all the able-bodied men of Tracy were. Not long after, the Tracy men showed up, throwing snowballs at the Marshall shovelers. It was noted that Tracy had plenty of water and plenty of beer, but she was rather short of live men. Back near Lamberton, William Snell took one last stereo view. View 1203 was the ruins of a sod house near Lamberton. I do not have this photograph. On April 19th, Sanborn's group finally broke through to Tracy. The blockade, which began on January 19th, had finally been raised. The Lyon County News termed it the end of a 3-month siege. The Marshall Messenger simply said, "At last." Although rain was falling, a large concourse of people had assembled at the depot to watch the first train come into the station. At about 8:30 in the morning, the first engine with a flat car arrived at the depot. 10 minutes later, Sanborn's construction train steamed up to the station, with shovelers crowding the platforms and windows, shouting greetings to the crowd. As Sanborn got off the train, the people of Marshall gave him 3 cheers. About 11 o'clock, a freight train of 14 cars arrived in Marshall. The utmost dispatch was used in sorting out freight and sending it to the various stores in town. The first passenger train arrived a little after noon, containing passengers and emigrants, a large amount of express matter and mail. The passenger train then returned to Sleepy Eye, taking several passengers who were eager to get out of town and others who were anxious to get to the cities to buy goods. William Snell's snow blockade views became hot commodities. Harper's Weekly, a national news publication, published a story about the blockade, including 6 of his views. However, Snell, along with Elmer and Tenney, claimed the story contained some exaggerations. The Harper's Weekly article was dated April 30th, 1881, and was entitled "The Snow Blockade." 3 of the 6 images shown were taken on the Winona and St. Peter Division. The article stated that 34 snowplows were put into service, each backed by 2 to 6 locomotives. It claimed a 48,000-pound snowplow, weighed down with 80,000 pounds of railway iron, and driven by 6 locomotives, could barely penetrate the deepest drifts. It noted that 324,000 cubic yards of snow were removed from just one cut, but in 8 hours the wind had piled it back in again. Finally, it said 9,000 men were employed from time to time as shovelers. The images on the left side are hand-drawn replicas of the actual views, which are shown on the right. The hand drawings were very well done. The first was titled "An Immense Snowdrift." The second was "Cutting the Snow into Blocks." The third was "Dragging out a Block of Snow." The fourth was 57 miles on a sail sled. The fifth was "Shoveling Out." And the sixth was "The Track Clear, Starting the Trains." Another of Snell's views caught his shadow in the snow. An example of a stereoscopic camera is shown on the right side. But Snell is not the photographer shown. Sanborn did not sit still after reaching Marshall, as the line still remained blocked to the west, as well as west of Tracy. The shovelers progressed to the next cut west of Marshall, which gave the residents there an opportunity to see the railroad men in action. Groceries slowly arrived in Marshall, but not right away. When sugar arrived, every store in town hung a banner advertising its return. On April 20th, the shovelers reached Minneota. Excitement in Minneota was high, but this quickly turned to disappointment as expectations of sugar, coffee, and tobacco were replaced by carloads of plows and sulkies. Even after a week, there were complaints that no fuel had been received, and very few provisions. By this time, the railroad was also dealing with washouts, not just snowdrifts. Becoming impatient, several residents of Minneota decided to take a trip to Marshall on a railroad handcar to forage for supplies. Not far out of town, they encountered a washout over 400 feet long. Proceeding into the water, in the handcar, they found the ties had washed away, and the car began to sink. Getting wet, the men abandoned the handcar and returned to their starting point. After a futile effort to find another way around the water, they decided to cross on what was left of the floating track. The writer said it was amusing to watch the men try to stay out of the cold water as they crossed one by one to the opposite shore. As they walked into Marshall, they soon found out there were no more supplies in Marshall than in Minneota. To add insult to injury, on the way back to Minneota, the boat they used to get across the water tipped over, and 2 men had to be rescued. The shoveling crew reached Canby on April 21st. Lake Benton was reached on April 28th. A Lake Benton correspondent announced, "An invoice of tobacco struck the town yesterday. Let the eagle scream." However, the Lake Benton people also complained about the lack of groceries on the first trains. One looked over all the farming supplies and said, "This is a dashed blanked, pretty-looking lot of stuff to eat." Gary, Dakota Territory, is located just across the Minnesota border northwest of Canby. Its local newspaper also published a tribute to Sanborn, saying he paid people's bills, hired teams to transport stranded passengers, and bought warm clothes for people. After dealing with snowdrifts and a flood, Sanborn's group finally reached Watertown on May 5th. After arriving back in Winona on May 7th, he noted there was a huge rush of immigration all along the line. The Lyon County News suggested that the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad should send Sanborn on a European vacation to compensate him for his efforts over the past winter. It was definitely one to remember. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.